Please give a warm welcome to Joe Duff.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm just so impressed with this crowd. It's just amazing the support you have here. Please dig deep and donate heavily to this organization. It's an amazing, amazing organization. You should be very proud. Anyway, I wanted to tell you a little bit about whooping cranes, but it's kind of embarrassing for me because I know there are people out there that are way smarter than I am, especially when it comes to birding. And people think if I flew with whooping cranes, I must be a great birder, and I'm not. You know, my knowledge is really species specific. And to give you an example of that lack of knowledge, I was once giving a presentation like this in Boise, Idaho, at the North American Ornithological Union. And after I was finished, this professor emeritus from one of the big universities approached me and started talking about it. And he had spent his whole life studying bird flight. And he was like 85 years old, just came back from China. And I was impressed by that. And I felt kind of odd because, he was studying bird flight and I've flown along with my hands on the back of a Canada goose like this. I had the viewpoint he envied, and so I felt weird about it. But I wanted to ask him how long he'd been back in the US. And I thought I'd use the expression, how long have you been in country? But based on the extent of his travels, I changed my expression, and without further thought, I asked him how long he'd been in continent. Intelligence is relative. Anyway, I wanted to tell you a little bit about whooping cranes. And that skipped, hang on. There. This is an adult pair of whooping cranes. They're 5 feet tall, the tallest bird in North America. They have a 7-foot wingspan. They're a pretty impressive animal. Male and female are called monomorphic, which means they're both identical and it's hard to tell them apart. These ones are juvenile whooping cranes that we flew with. And you can see the mottleness of their early colors is slowly changing to white. You can't tell the difference between the male and the female except if you happen to witness a unison call. And it's an antiphonal call, so the male will start and a second later the female will join. And the reason they call them whooping cranes is because of that call. Except it's a lot louder than that. And you can hear them from miles away. And they're an impressive creature in the first place. And so, This is Wood Buffalo National Park in the Northwest Territories of Canada. It's 17,000 square miles of park. It's the third largest national park in the world. And it was founded way back when to protect wood bison. But in 1954, they found out that that was the last nesting grounds for the final flock of whooping cranes that existed. In 1945, there were 16 birds in that flock. That's it. That's all they existed. And they migrated all the way down to the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, which is on the Gulf Coast of Texas. That's 2,500-mile migration. Now, Texas, of course, is a busy place. There's lots of boating traffic, lots of recreational fishermen. There's a lot of refineries down there, and it's crowded. So there's 9 separate threats to that environment. So we needed new flocks. That was critical. But the problem was, how do you condition those birds to follow the aircraft? You see, there's 2 basic types of birds, and most of you likely know this. There's altricial birds like robins and most passerines. And when they're hatched, they can't see, they can't walk, they can't move, they can't keep themselves warm. They're basically helpless, and they depend on overworked parents to keep them fed. And when their muscles develop and their feathers mature, they leave the nest and they fly off and somehow learn to migrate all on their own. They don't need a parent to guide them. That's genetically built into their system. And they do it very accurately, and we really have no idea what methods they're using. The other side of that equation is precocial birds. Precocial birds are like whooping cranes and swans and geese. And they leave the nest almost immediately after they're hatched. They have down feathers to keep them warm, and they'll wander through the marsh with their parents, looking for food and protection. So nature has evolved this whole instinct of imprinting. They'll imprint on their parents or the first thing that nurtures them. And whooping cranes learn to migrate by following their parents to the wintering grounds. So if you were to release them in northern Wisconsin and left them there, they would just stay. They might wander around a bit, but they'd probably end up freezing to death. So we really needed some method of teaching them how to fly, how to migrate. And so this is natural imprinting, and this happens all by itself. We don't have to do anything. We just let the birds figure it out. If you want to cross-imprint them and get them to follow people, then that's a whole different thing, and it requires a lot of persistence because it takes hours. We did all this thing in full costume. We wore this big baggy costume that basically just disguised our human shape so that the birds weren't familiar with people. And that worked. We weren't allowed to talk anywhere near the birds, and it worked well. It required a lot of work and persistence, though, and if you wanted to get them used to the aircraft, well, that required passion, even more passion, more than persistence. And then if you wanted to actually follow the aircraft in the air, well, that's, basically stubbornness. That's the only way you could do it. And of course, if you wanted to lead those birds all the way to Florida, well, that was just foolishness. It just didn't make any sense. But we managed to do it, And so we had this natural flock migrating between Wisconsin, or between Wood Buffalo National Park and Texas. So the recovery team, the whooping crane recovery team, selected a site in Wisconsin as the reintroduction site, and Florida as their wintering grounds. So it was up to us to lay out that plan. So we plotted a route that avoided all kinds of controlled airspace around Chicago and Atlanta, and that kept us over open territory, so if something happens, we could land with them. And then, of course, we needed to pick stopover sites along the way. Whooping cranes are soaring birds, and they fly like a hawk or an eagle. They'll find a thermal, and they'll glide up on that, raising altitude, and then they'll glide to the next one and follow up that one and just keep going all the way south, and that's how they migrate without much energy. We don't have the talent to fly like that. We don't have the fuel range, and we didn't have the bladders. And so our birds learned to fly on the vortices coming off the wingtip. As we plowed through the air, we created this wake, and the birds just instinctively figured out how to fly on that wake. So we would have the lead bird maybe that far from the wingtip and just gliding along. But that could only happen on calm days. If the wing was bouncing around, the birds had to chase it, and they used up all their energy chasing it, and 45 minutes of that, and they were exhausted. So we had to fly on those very calm mornings. And calm mornings don't last very long, so we had 1, maybe 2 hours. Birds fly at 38 miles an hour, so we had stops every 50 miles along the route. Now, that line looks all straight and clever and direct, point A to point B, but sometimes the birds didn't want to leave. So we'd do what's called an aerial rodeo for an hour, trying to get the birds, to convince the birds it's time to move on. However, the GPS logged that route, and that's what it actually looked like. The stopover hosts along the way were really generous. We'd knock on their door and say, we'd like to bring a team of 10 people and 20 birds, and we're going to set up a pen. And I always said it's kind of like the world's worst mother-in-law story, because you didn't know when you were going to get there. And you were going to fill the front yard full of motorhomes and the backyard full of airplanes. And that field you own down there where the birds are, you can't go down there anymore. And we're going to plug into all your electric outlets and your hose. And what's your internet password again? But they were very generous. We made a lot of good friends. And our migrations took an average of 83 days to complete them. But we only flew on about 24 of those days. So there was a lot of hanging around, and Lou Cambert and Linda Cambert can attest to that. And I think they, at one point, were going to put out a mailbox for us at the end of their street. The aircraft we flew are referred to as trikes because they have 3 wheels. They've got 2 seats and an engine at the back, so they're called a pusher aircraft. And we built protection for the propeller so the birds wouldn't get injured. And it flies kind of like a hang glider. You know, you've got a control bar in front of you. And we had 3 of them, and we had 3 pilots. And they were about the only aircraft we could use where the birds could actually see us and follow us because they knew us. And it was it could fly slowly enough for whooping cranes. And they fly at about 38 miles an hour. You know, the Wright brothers, when they first took off, they were doing 45 miles an hour, so it was difficult to find an aircraft that would go that slowly. There were 3 pilots. That was Richard Van Hoevelen on the left, and me in the center, and Brooke Pennypacker on the right. And we were all high-time trike pilots, so it worked out well. We did all the training, all of the flying, and basically we're responsible for the birds. And then we also had a team of handlers and truck drivers and vet techs and outreach people. And so we all had to wear those big baggy costumes. And if you ever happen to see those people at a grocery store, you should walk over and shake their hands. They're easy to recognize. They were dedicated people. But, you know, they're a gathering of A-type personalities. So you really can't dictate what they're going to do. And they had a lot of fun at Halloween. We weren't the first organization to attempt to protect whooping cranes and somehow teach them to migrate. Back in the 1970s, they took eggs from Wood Buffalo National Park, and they put them in sandhill crane nests in Boise, or in Grays Lake, Idaho. And it worked fairly well. The idea was to cross-foster them so that the sandhill cranes would teach them how to migrate and how to be wild birds. And that worked perfectly, except that when they reached maturity, sexual maturity, when they were about 4 or 5 years old, they wanted to mate with sandhill cranes. Now, the sandhill cranes didn't have the same problem. This is kind of like the perfect ugly duckling story, right? But the sandhill cranes didn't have the same problem, so you had all these lonely whooping cranes looking for love in all the wrong places. But occasionally they did hook up, because we ended up with a couple of whoop hills, which is not the best idea, because they don't breed, they're infertile. So the first person to fly with birds was Bill Lishman, fly with actual formation of imprinted birds. And he did this in southern Ontario near my hometown. And he was just celebrated all over the county, because he'd fly along in the morning and he'd stop the school buses and all the traffic would stop and wave at him. And he had a terrific time doing this, but it was just a flight of fancy. It was a way to share the sky with nature. But he had a lot of publicity, and so that publicity got the scientific community interested in it, and his fun flights turned into something that had purpose. I joined him in 1993. He and I were pilots together, so we partnered. And I thought that I used to be a photographer, and I thought, well, I'll take the summer off, and that turned into the fall, and it turned into the following spring, and then it turned into a lifetime. So you got to be careful what you wish for. We learned a lot of important things when working with Canada geese. Like, for one thing, you should never fly directly behind a whooping crane, because they don't like to carry excess baggage, and they'll get rid of it whenever they can. So a full-face helmet is advisable. We tried to train the birds to follow the aircraft, so we pushed it around. We didn't want to start the engine because we hadn't figured out that bird guard, we didn't want to make goose soup. So we pushed it around. Well, it weighs 400 pounds. And so that got tired really quickly. Well, Bill's a sculptor, and he built this little thing you pull around, and it had a little recording that made an engine noise, but you still, if you weren't careful, you could run over them. So he built this second thing, and this was something you could pull over your shoulders, and then you ran up and down the runway making engine noises. And it's kind of like, it's just something you want to do in the privacy of your own backyard. It's kind of a ridiculous concept, but it did work really well. So we started out with Canada geese because they were non-endangered. Then we worked with trumpeter swans for a while. And then we eventually worked with sandhill cranes because we wanted to see if it would work with a crane species. And the whole time I was attending all of these whooping crane recovery team meetings and telling them how we were doing. By that time, we'd actually conducted, I think, 11 migration experiments. So we were starting to figure it out. Anyway, you have to understand, this is like a tough sale because Bill was a sculptor, I was a photographer, neither of us had a degree in any of the environmental studies. And we were both from Canada, so we were foreigners. And we were trying to convince the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that the best way to save their endangered species was to dress up in a costume and lead them across the country in an airplane that made of the same material as lawn chairs. But it did work. We finally convinced them it was an idea that would work. So we were founding members of the Whooping Crane Eastern Partnership. There were 9 federal, state, and private organizations in that group. We were by far the smallest. And we began in 2001, and each spring we'd raise a flock of birds at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, and then we'd teach them how to follow the aircraft over the course of the summer and lead them all the way to Florida. We started in 2001 and we ended in 2015 when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ended the program. They didn't give us any more birds, so they didn't think it was working very well, but I tend to disagree. We started at Patuxent, which is just north of Washington, D.C., and it's a U.S. Geological Survey facility. They had the largest captive flock of whooping cranes, and they produced all the eggs we released into the wild. So that's where we hatched the birds. That's where we got them used to the aircraft for the first time. And we would use this big circle pen. It was about 30 feet in diameter, and it had 2 feet high, and it protected the chicks from the wheels and the propellers. And we would just go around this pen on a regular basis. We had sometimes 18 birds. We had to work with 1 bird at a time, and we had to do it every day. And we couldn't do it midday when it was really hot. So it was a lot of work. It just took effort, huge effort. And when it was all done, it kind of looked like this. The birds followed the aircraft really well. We had a big long puppet that we could reach out into the pen over the fence, and you could pull a trigger in the handle and it would drop mealworms. And the chicks would follow the mealworms and you'd move the aircraft, and that's how they became used to following that aircraft. But again, it was a huge amount of work, a lot of effort by a lot of people to get that done. When the birds were old enough and their growth plates had all sealed up, we could put them in these crates and then move them out to, airlift them out to Wisconsin from Maryland. And it's funny, we got them there, and we used to work with the International Crane Foundation, and the first thing they wanted to do was x-ray the birds because at Patuxent, it's an old facility, right? And the odd nail would come out of the roof, and there'd be metal in the pen, and the birds have a habit of eating that stuff. So if you dropped your keys, they were either in the bird's guzzle or they were in the watering pan somewhere. So at ICF figured that out, that they could x-ray the birds right in their boxes, right? There was plastic box. So they x-rayed these birds, and the next day, I was there, and they kind of shuffled me out of the room. They wanted to play a trick on somebody. So the next day, they sent this x-ray of a bird, and they had taken a bunch of stuff from the shop and double exposed the x-rays, and they said, look what we found in one of the Patuxent birds. And there was a pair of keys and a hinge and a couple of screws. When we first got the birds to Wisconsin, we didn't put the wing back on because they couldn't fly anyway, and they would just chase after the aircraft. And I always found it amazing to watch these guys flapping their wings, and they had no idea what those things were for, really. There's no evidence. There's no fingers. You couldn't pick stuff up. They just flapped their wings. And it was actually fascinating to watch when that finally happened, when they got on the threshold of flying and that penny dropped and they realized what they're for. Fledging is kind of, it's a rite of passage for birds. That's when they leave their youth behind and begin to live in three dimensions. We would fly with them, and the problem with that initially is you had to go about 35 miles an hour to get the aircraft airborne. And the birds took 2 steps, and they took off. So that meant we were 50 or 60 or 100 feet behind us. And what they were trying to do is catch the wing and make it easier to fly. So we had to lift the aircraft off and then push it as slowly as we can make it go. Now, anybody who flies knows that when you slow an aircraft down, it stops being an aircraft and it turns into a brick, And And so we were flying 30 or 40 feet off the ground at the very edge of stall. And we poked that bear a lot. And so it did work, though. They figured it out. You can see the birds now learning how to find that sweet spot on the wing. It's funny because we used to have a bird that used to fly in front of the wing, and that meant that he was disturbing the lift on that side, right? So the aircraft would just slowly turn like this, and we had to hold him up, and he kept getting in that front spot. And so that bird would fly just ahead of the wing, so I'd speed up so his feet were over the wing, and then I'd push the wing up really quickly and topple him over, and he'd drop, and then catch and come back up. And it was a fabric-covered wing. It didn't hurt him, but it did finally teach him that he can't fly there, and I called it flipping the bird. Once they got older, they figured this out. And this is over Georgia one flight, and we're at 4,000 feet, and the birds, you can see they're hardly doing any work. That's because the air is dead calm and the wing is stable, and that bird's kind of bored. He's poking at the wing. And you can see one of the other pilots up there in the chase aircraft. We used to take turns being the leader, and the rest of us would fly a chase. In 2006, we had the first breeding pair. Whooping cranes don't breed until they're 4, 5, or 6 years old. And so 2006, we've been at it for 6 years. And so we had a pair that actually figured out how to breed. They defended a territory. They laid a pair of eggs. And they abandoned that nest. So they tried again. They found a new territory, laid 2 more eggs, and both of the eggs survived. Usually they lay 2 eggs and only 1 survives. It's kind of nature's way of giving them 2 chances at raising 1 chick. But these survived. They have to be protected for the first 100 days before they can learn to fly. So it's a very dangerous time for them. And that did work, except for about the last day. One of the birds was taken by a predator, so there was only 1 left. But it was still, we celebrated that 1 bird. You can see how big that young male was. It was a huge bird compared to its parents. And it survived well. They stayed around Wisconsin until December. That 1 bird, known as Wild 106, was the first migratory whooping crane hatched in the wild in the U.S. since 1898. So it was quite an achievement for us. They hung around Wisconsin until the first... They hung around Wisconsin until the first snowfall, and I watched them take off and catch the first thermal that would carry them all the way to Florida. And December 3rd of that year, we got a signal that they were in the pen in Florida. So after all those experiments, I think 15 experiments by that time, that was the first time we could show that we could teach a migration route to a parent and it would pass it off to the offspring. So we could actually establish or reestablish new migration routes. Unfortunately, the following year, that bird was shot by somebody, a miner, having fun, didn't know what he was doing, and he shot the bird. That bird, we had about $100,000 invested in that bird to teach it how to migrate. It migrated back and forth for 5 years between Florida and Wisconsin. It found a mate. It was a successful parent, and the shooter got a $1 fine. After that, though, we didn't have an influx of birds. They kept abandoning their nests, and it took a while to figure it out. We'd have maybe 15 pairs breeding and laying eggs, but they had all abandoned them. And we figured out later on that it was a problem with black flies. Black flies, there's 250 species of black flies in North America. 3 are known to target birds, and all 3 were present at the Naceda National Wildlife Refuge. So you can see the blood on the back of that bird because the black flies will dig through the feathers and bite their skin. And if you see that red patch on the forehead, that black part of the back is all black flies. So they were forced off their nest. And that happens to owls, and it also happens to loons sometimes. And they often have years where there's no reproduction at all. And when they abandon the eggs, they're mostly taken by our predators, but you can see how the black flies seem to like that. And it was a real issue. So Fish and Wildlife, though, they said that, well, the sandhill cranes here are doing okay, they're surviving, so it must be your technique that's the problem. You know, you're hand teaching these birds, you're being raised by humans, even if they're in costume, and they're missing important nurturing lessons that they, well, we did a study later on, and they said the sandhill cranes there were doing fine. We did a study later on, and it turns out the sandhills weren't doing as well as the whooping cranes. So it was, we were flying down through southern Wisconsin at one point, and we often got split up, you know, in the air, and we each grabbed groups of birds, and there was one bird that was flying behind me, and so I picked him up, and I let him down, and I was first there, and I landed, and you can see him, he flies over top of the aircraft, and it's directly in front of me, and the grass was wet, and I couldn't stop. And I had that camera running. I thought, I got to look at that again. That's really amazing how close he came to that wheel. And you can see that the yellow thing is the wheel pan. And he came right there. It was a well-timed, get out of the way. The thing is that whooping cranes have very skinny legs, right? There's bone, there's artery, and there's tendons, and that's it. And so if they break a leg, they don't survive. One of the things we had to do once in a while was cut the grass on the runway and disinfect the pens and do all the maintenance, you know, we needed to do. We couldn't do that with the birds there. So what we would do is get two of the interns to just walk the birds off into the marsh about a half a mile away, out of sight and sound, and then we'd move in with the lawnmowers and the tractors and do all the cleaning. And then the birds would come back and they wouldn't even notice the difference. But anyway, while we were out there, I decided I want to take some pictures. So I put my costume on and I put my big camera underneath in a white pillowcase so it looked like part of my costume. And I walked out, and as I was walking out, there was an adult bird that we'd raised about 5 years earlier. And he was an aggressive bird, and we were kind of on the edge of his territory. So I was worried that he might be a problem, you know, and attack the chicks. So there's about 50 different calls, displays, postures, or behaviors that we know the meaning of. So we could watch these birds, and then we could replicate that, and we could almost communicate with them. It was almost like talking with a bird. It was an amazing situation to be in. When you wore that costume, it made all the difference. And these are some of the defense calls. So when this bird tried to approach the chicks, I stepped in front of him. And I had a puppet, and he had he wanted to show how tall he was, so he stood up tall, and I raised my puppet, and we had this incremental fight on who's taller. Well, he's 5 feet, and my hand's about 7, so I won that one. So then he goes around this bush to try to get around me, and I stepped in front of him again, and he was mad, so he stamped his feet in the marsh, and I stamped my rubber boots in the marsh, and we had this standoff that lasted about 20 minutes. It was incredible. He opened his wings up, made himself big, and I bellowed out my costume. And went on and on. And there's a posture. It's kind of like high school. That's what it's like, you know. Boys in high school, you know, who want to be confrontational but don't want to start a fight they can't win, right? They want to leave with their dignity intact. So this display is called a stick toss. So the bird thinks, you're not important to me. I can turn around my back on you and I can play over here. You're just not important. So he's playing with a stick down here and he's got his eye on me. I'm playing with my stick over here, the two of us back to back. And this went on and on. And so finally, after about a half an hour, he got bored. And so he turned around and chased a dragonfly off, and I turned my back on him so we didn't have another confrontation. It was just an incredible experience to be that close to an animal. It's just mind-boggling. When we flew over Georgia one time, we flew over Jimmy Carter's house. And so his Secret Service officer called up and said, well, can Jimmy and his wife come out and watch you land in Georgia? And I said, of course, but you know, he can't just stand around anywhere, because if he's standing out by the pen, the birds won't land there. They just won't land. And so I said, if you dress up in camel outfits and hide in the trees, yeah, you can do it. So he did. And he did it actually 3 times. And he helped us build the pen. And his wife showed us how to remove sand burrs with a handful of rock cotton. It was quite an interesting character, and he helped us a lot. He donated and helped us with a lot of political situations. I also took Jane Goodall flying. I invited her to go flying. And it's funny because I phoned up I emailed the Jane Goodall Institute, and I invited her. And I got a call from Mary Lewis, her right-hand person, who said, well, Jane is booked like a year in advance, and she travels for 320 days every year, so I'm sorry she can't make it. About a week passed, and then Mary Lewis called again and said, we told Jane about it, and she's canceled 2 meetings at the UN, and she'll be here tomorrow. So I took her flying. When you put an extra person in the back seat of the aircraft, it makes it heavier. And the only way you can compensate for that weight is to fly faster. And so I had Brooke Pennypacker lead the birds, and there was a long string of them, and then Jane and I came up behind them. So we had this whole string of birds right in front of us. It was a beautiful morning, and she was very impressed. Jane is she's a wonderful person. She's very spiritual, and she believes that hope is the way if you talk about how bad things are, all you do is depress people. So if you talk about the hope, and that was her whole idea, is speaking about hope. And she said that we used to number the birds. We didn't want to name them because we wanted people not to think they were pets, because these birds had a lot of celebrity. And if somebody knew they were somewhere, they'd go see them, and they wanted to get closer for a picture. And that's how you tame a bird down. So we numbered them. And Jane said, she named her chimpanzees, starting with David Graybeard. And she said people are more impressed by names than numbers. So you can attract more attention and get more support if you name them. And I said, that's probably true, but we're not going to do it. So she started calling me number 17. See if I liked it. So from 2001 to 2015, we led birds over 17,000 miles on the 15 migrations, 1,250 miles each. And that doesn't account for any of the training flights at all. So it was even more than that. I think I have accumulated about 5,000 hours of flying trike time. So it's a long, hard effort. When we left, there was we released 167 birds into the wild. So that's what makes up the population. So Operation Migration left the Whooping Crane Eastern Partnership. We had 103 birds in that population. I heard 2 days ago that there are now 64. That's all that's left. So it's not doing that well. It requires more input and a lot more work, but it's just the way it goes. There's a new museum opening up in Madison, Wisconsin. It's going to open up in 2027, and it's by the Wisconsin Historical Society. I was telling people earlier that I had a whole basement full of chick records and video and tons of information, articles, just tons of it. And I was going to toss it all in the garbage. Well, they want it for their historical collection. You can see the front of that building. There's a glass atrium, and you can see up in the top left-hand corner, that's going to be our aircraft hanging from that atrium. So it's going to be pretty impressive. We also have an aircraft at the EAA Experimental Aircraft Association in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and we have a third at the National Air and Space Museum. So that's where we are with whooping cranes. I mean, I'm hoping that someday we can start a population again and build those numbers back up, but so far it doesn't look that good. So we did our best. But I haven't given up on all conservation. I now work for an organization called Wildlife Canada Society, based out of BC. And our latest project is to reintroduce muskox into the area around Churchill. Churchill, Manitoba, on Georgian Bay, is considered the polar bear capital of the world, because that's the most accessible place in the whole world where you can see polar bears. Polar bears spend all of their winter on the ice hunting for seals. That's their main food source. But they come off the ice when it melts, and that's traditionally 100 days when the bay is ice-free. And at that point, there's a few bird eggs to eat, maybe some berries, but nothing else. And one of the reasons we want to reintroduce muskox is to bring that species back. Back in 1905, all the muskox around that area were wiped out by a commercial hunt. So we want to bring them back. And that was back in the fur trade time. And so the idea of bringing them back is to polar bears and muskox coexisted for hundreds of years, so we can rebalance nature by bringing them back. But it's also going to do a lot for the tourist industry. And that's not just about money. All these people go to Churchill to see polar bears and beluga whales and the northern lights, and they're there for a week, and it's a real education opportunity. So we can educate them about muskox, because Canada used to have 85,000 muskox, and we're down now to 45,000. We don't know why. They're so isolated, nobody can find out. It's a slow process, but if we can raise the interest for muskox, we can help that species. So that's the idea. They're a beautiful creature. They've been around for years, but they use the most extreme habitat in the world, and there's no place else further north for them to go. So that's a real ambition of ours. Another benefit of muskox is that they shed their undercoat. It's called kiviot, and it sheds naturally in spring, and it's 7 times warmer than the best quality wool and 4 times more expensive than cashmere. That sweater, that's a kiviot sweater, and that sells for $1,800. So that's a great industry for local artisans. We've also worked we're trying to save habitat for the jaguars in Brazil. We're raising money to buy habitat, and we've worked with pangolins in Vietnam. And we're also funding the world's most diverse reef ecosystem in Indonesia. Is 300,000 acre no-take zone that there's no fishing of any type in it. And National Geographic was there a few years ago and said that a football-sized area of that ecosystem is 7 times more diverse than the entire Caribbean. Just an amazing place. And they've developed a resource now called the Missoul Resort. And it is one of the most exclusive diving opportunities in the world. The stuff you can do there is mind-boggling. So I always say that if you're a conservationist and you're tired of beating your head against the wall, it's a great place to go vacation, because every time you ask a question, there's this incredible answer to how they made it work. You know, they've taken the money and they've built kindergartens for the local residents, the local people that live in the villages. They had a problem with plastic down there, because you buy a lot of stuff in plastic, but there's no place to put it. It's all islands, and they're all made of coral. You can't bury it, you can't burn it, so it was going in the ocean. So they have a ship that comes out with supplies every year, and it goes around to all the villages and buys all their plastic, takes it back to Sarong, which is 7 hours away, and they've bought a property, and they take that plastic and recycle it and make it into pellets that you can make other stuff. So there's 70,000 tons a month of plastic that was ocean bound is now being recycled. And when it was all organized, they gave the whole operation to the villagers. So they run it all now. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you very much. This is a photograph, a video when we were over Georgia one time. We were at 5,000 feet. And we started to come down, slowly descend, and the birds didn't have to follow the aircraft anymore, so I just was able to hold my camera up and watch them come all the way down. It was just a lovely way to end an exhausting flight, and a good way to end this talk. Anyway, thank you very much for all your support and all your help.